everyone, my name's Shepheard. I'm the office manager for Charles Stanley's Oxford branch. Today I'm joined by Glenn Baker, who is Charles Stanley's Business Development Director based out of London. For today's video, Glenn and I are going to be discussing vulnerability across a wide range of areas. So Glenn, it feels like the very definition of vulnerability is shifting, environmentally, socially, psychologically, for example. It also feels that, COVID-19 has really put this into focus. So how comfortable do you think we should be or not? That the world around us and ourselves as people perhaps should not only be accepting of this, but also be prepared to deal with this change?
Well, it's a great question, isn't it, Ria? And it's something that it really does feel as though, it's given the year that we've had and coming up to a year and a half now, is one in which vulnerability has been put to the test. And I really do include in that a sense of vulnerability that also transcends regulatory definitions. I think one of the key themes emerging is that we could perhaps view our current times as being defined by a particular type of vulnerability, to think of it as a quality as much as a quantity. So one psychological impact of coronavirus perhaps is that we seem to be more aware of our vulnerability, which has been brought into our collective consciousness so much more, hasn't it?
Yeah, so do you think then, business owners, people working in different industries and sectors have, not only been affected in the short term, but obviously, looking at the long-term picture as well, in terms of the impacts of our vulnerabilities?
I do, definitely, Ria. I think this is long-term in its effects, but at the same time, I also think it's a question of perspective. It's always been long-term. We are in an age where there are long-term problems, and we can sometimes just focus on the here and now and lose sight of the bigger picture. I can understand why. We've just lived through a pandemic, of course, but of course there are longer-term things at play here. For example, our sense of reality has come under threat recently, hasn't it, in the here and now? But this jolts us to wake up to those long-term issues, as I said, that are already there, whilst we have been aware of, say, for example, the existential threats of the climate emergency, for instance. That awareness may have existed for a long time in a theoretical form, really, but not anymore. This increased sense of awareness is broadening, I would suggest, across society and across the generations. And I think one of the long-term effects of COVID will be a renewed light on collective responsibility, among families, the younger generations increasingly eager to help the elder, and among communities around those families, on laying aside differences and working together. So genuinely assisting the vulnerable then.
So what do you think is going to be the key change? What's actually going to happen as life goes forward?
Well, I think one of the areas that has certainly come to light in recent months in particular is a renewed sense that belonging and purpose improve health, that people are healthier when they're connected to social and community supports, when they are empowered to play meaningful roles in both their own health and in the health of their wider community. And of course, the same is true, isn't it, within families across generations, where family members play a part in the lives of other family members. For coronavirus has shown us, I think, hasn't it, that how much we rely upon social connectivity and the great challenge to our lives when that connectivity is deeply affected. This is very much what I mean about the quality of our vulnerability. As I said a moment ago, it's been brought into our collective awareness so much more. It's something very much that we work through as families or as business owners needing support, and will do so for a very long time to come. And a key point here, if I may, is that it is possible that the notion of collective responsibility, as I said a moment ago, could now carry beyond the crisis of COVID-19 with a renewed sense of agency. It will no longer be enough to simply hold opinions, I would suggest, unless we are willing to take matters in hand and do something about those opinions, about our values, about our beliefs, and that will certainly be true for entrepreneurs and business owners who want to make a difference in the world and in, as I say, in their communities.
So getting into, a bit more of the detail, what impact is recent times likely to have had, on ourselves, the likes of business owners, families? What do you think is like the most important thing to be aware of?
Well, as I said, Rhea, I mean, vulnerability is undergoing fundamental reassessment. Who is vulnerable and why? This will be expanded and redefined, I think, appropriately for our times. And those business owners, for example, that are providing social solutions have the opportunity really to dramatically impact society and culture. And there is a key driver in all of this as to why this opportunity presents itself, and indeed why we are able to recognize it, in fact. And indeed, why is it so important to be aware of what's impacting the way we see the world now, as you have asked? I mean, this really has to do with the evolution of our emotional and social intelligence as one of the key advancements, I would suggest, of the modern human condition. I mean, we are now emotionally intelligent enough to know that our levels of vulnerability are increasing and not decreasing, as was generally believed in the second half of the 20th century. I mean, it's not that long ago. So as we grow in emotional intelligence, we are realizing just how vulnerable we might all become.
Yeah, it's really interesting points. Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Of course, absolutely. I mean, what I'm saying is that as humans, we are still evolving, either evolve to realign with new values, or the social contract will be withdrawn, for example, is a modern idiom in the way to express that. And that's the world we now live in. An inflection point is approaching, which is driven by necessity. So what we measure no longer necessarily reflects what we value. So we could well be compelled to create longer term value. We will all be adjudged by new economic metrics in due course, it is likely. I mean, I'm thinking here, for example, of decarbonisation, for instance. Approaches to carbon removal not only avoid emissions, but also reverse them. Engineered solutions include direct air capture and conversion of waste gases, for instance. I mean, this is science with a conscience. I mean, that's my point, this idea around science now having a conscience. And it's a very transdisciplinary approach, which is therefore now emerging, in which the scientific model is married to a psychology that recognizes, modifies and channels both the creative and the destructive potential of human beings. I mean, I think that's a key point. And that is a massive stride forward in the human story. Just to sort of think big here for a moment, but it is. But just to come back to what I was saying, how have we got here and why now in the human story, as I've just said? The answer is social emotional intelligence. That at least is one of the answers. It's certainly one of the key advancements in recent human evolution, which has helped us to empathize with and so better understand our societies, ourselves, and our planet. And the growing role of social emotional intelligence, I would suggest, will now be critical to survival in any new kind of economy or looking further out, in a new or second renaissance, when it is likely that technological dogmas such as connectivity, speed, optimization, all the things we've come to rely upon, will be at least supplemented quite heavily with human relevance, purpose, human engagement, human relationships, and human self-realization. So, I mean, just very quickly on that, we see traces of that already. A challenge for the education system, for example, in the UK, is educational relevance. The ability of the human spirit to adapt and thrive in a world of change and uncertainty, as we've come to see with COVID.
So do you think that, COVID-19 has accelerated, the formation of such new framework of value?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, isn't it? I mean, it's maybe, but also maybe not. And I say maybe not because our physical, relational, mental, and digital landscapes were already fundamentally complex patchworks, accumulating over the long term, long before COVID. This has been in going on.
So do you think the experience around COVID has actually then been more to do with survival than change? And, obviously for businesses, won't they be focusing more on the survival mode?
Yes, I think you're right, Ria. That is true. But I would add that from the mindset of a business owner or an entrepreneur, for example, dealing with survival also gives the opportunity for change. We are much more likely to be able to avert problems or a catastrophe in the future if we are able to anticipate such problems or indeed catastrophes. I mean, just to sort of let us into that, think our way into that a little bit. Let's take the well-documented example of the movement for the climate emergency. I mean, this is so much richer in its meaning when we understand that our social emotional intelligence is now catching up with the damage that has been done to the planet. So survival, yes, of course, but we have the opportunity, don't we, for change, because we now recognize the dangers and can avert a complete catastrophe. So more broadly speaking, your point about survival, yes, but change is inevitable and businesses need to be able to obviously adapt. So this has to do with building resilience and such plans so that a business and its operating model can adapt across time. So just to put some color around this very quickly, I mean, according to the World Economic Forum, 65% of children in primary school today will ultimately end up working in completely new job types that do not yet exist. I mean, that's an extraordinary future, isn't it? Where adaptability, creativity, originality, and innovation will be central to any plans around the resilience of a business.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is there, one word that you could say that would sum up that future then? What's one thing that could really sort of deeply impact business owners and entrepreneurs, in the future ahead of us?
There is, Ria. And for me, I would say it's behavior. There is at least one dominant trope that societies, cultures, and economies evolve around, which I'm suggesting can be summed up in the word behavior. The psychological and the emotional drivers of why clients or customers or people and societies do what they do can help us to understand the direction they might be heading in. And if we project from where we currently are standing, then we can see the further rise of a behavioral economy. I mean, there are clues already. The data of our lives has been collected and stored by governments and corporations. I mean, what appears to be free is in fact an exchange of consumer data, exemplified by the Internet of all things. Although there is a buoyant market for data scientists right now, it is likely that we are on actually the cusp of a shift. And I say that because it's not so much the consumer data of our lives that will be increasingly of interest, but rather our very human emotions and behaviors. So here, what I'm suggesting is that the Internet of all things is likely to give way to the Internet of all behaviors, and jobs, companies, and economics will require new skills and competencies that can drive, interpret, and respond to the behaviors of people.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, obviously we show our behaviours in all kinds of ways that we may or may not be aware of, and our behaviours and how they're received, that then drives sort of all aspects of our lives as well.
Absolutely, it certainly does, and I'd add to that actually that the technologies we use and the tech breakthroughs that will come are not only generating data about the digital and physical realms through which we move. So much more significantly, for example, we reveal more about our wishes and our anxieties to search engines than we do to our families or friends. I mean, that's extraordinary when you think about it, isn't it? But actually, it's ordinary practice now, isn't it? You know, our phones and social media platforms reveal more about our behaviors, preferences, and states of mind than we may be aware of, in fact, probably. And so what we are looking at here then, as I would suggest, is the growing role of our emotions and behaviours in an economy that will be further built around the output of those emotions and behaviours, and the degree to which persuasiveness, for example, will be applied to our lives in what we feel and do. I mean, to put this another way very quickly, we are entering a world of increasingly advanced instruments of persuasion, so specifically to direct the behaviours of people. So we may think of the social rise of influencers who are looked to in order to influence behaviour, and of course they are usually promotional, be that self-promotion or on behalf of a brand or a company or an organisation. But this is at an embryonic stage currently when compared with how this economy is likely to develop over the next couple of decades. So what I'm suggesting is that the role of influencing behaviours across societies and cultures will expand exponentially and in ways that we cannot yet imagine. We should remember that marketeers and advertisers have already been using behavioural economic principles to boost sales and profits. I mean, this is not new. This is this commercial focus on behaviour has been with us for quite some time. It is just that it's going to become of increasingly more significance in the type of world we will live in. That's my point.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, what about consumers? What's the future going to be like for them? What's their role in this new sort of kind of economy? And, how would that align with businesses across all different sectors?
Indeed. I mean, as you imply, this goes much deeper, and it does. I mean, the role of a consumer is changing, and social media is becoming problematic for encouraging misinformation and causing mental health problems. The environment or environmental impact of consuming materials leads us to rightly question the role that consumption plays in our lives. So for many brands, actually, this presents a conundrum. I mean, relating to people as consumers encourages consistent switching from one brand to another brand. So this in turn propels people to buy this brand or buy that brand. And so they tend to consume more. So those brands that are future focused, if you want to put it that way, are likely to be attracted to deploying behavioral design principles. And what I mean by that is that these principles will engage with people to fix rather than replace products, for example. So this would involve brands helping people to buy less and be more resourceful, and in this way engendering brand loyalty. I mean, behavioral economics would also help to create strategies for companies so as to increase their impact in serving the greater good, for instance, and significant growth opportunities might go to those who can create the business models that this segment requires. I mean, current consumers, they crave innovative approaches using behavioral capabilities that will empower and engage them rather than exploit and alienate them. And I think that's a really, really important point to understand. And that is something that COVID-19 has undoubtedly put the spotlight more intensely on. Companies that can fill this gap of empowering and engaging rather than exploiting and alienating, those companies could see mass market potential when identifying and building the relevant skills and competencies needed.
So on that note then, what do you think the relevant skills and competencies will look like? What is it that the businesses are going to be looking for here?
Well, I mean, we have implied some of those skills already in what we've discussed. I mean, the answer is that the emerging skills to be most valued across global regions and sectors will include analytical thinking, innovation, creativity, originality. At the same time, however, equally prevalent will be social skills, such as persuasion, emotional intelligence, as already mentioned, and teaching others. It is likely that these will be in higher demand across industries than narrow technical skills such as programming or equipment operation and control. Technical skills, in other words, will need to be supplemented with strong social and collaboration skills. I mean, a whole new breed of consultant is likely to emerge, specializing in the ability to start and then competitively win conversations, for example. In other words, it is highly likely that many future jobs will evolve around measuring, understanding, and shaping behavior, which will drive value and competitive success, as well as being a direct conduit, working for the greater good of societies and the environment. So how I see it is businesses will be taking on a broader spread of responsibility across at least 4 key areas: to their clients or customers, to their employees and the well-being of their employees, to society more generally, although to specific segments of society, depending on the nature of the business's sector and output, and of course to the environment and to sustainable development. We have, of course, found ourselves discussing one of the dominant narratives of our time, ESG. I mean, it's hard not to. It lives and breathes in a lot of what we do.
Yeah, I agree with that. So to sum up then, issues around vulnerability have obviously been evolving for quite some time, and the role of the consumer is also changing. So with that in mind, how do we look to the future? What can we actively do? Not just businesses, but as individuals, and what's the best way that we can be prepared for that?
I mean, that is a massive question, but I think one way to answer it is, if you allow me, is to think of Charles Darwin, actually, who said that nature as a whole is in a constant state of change. And something that coronavirus has taught us, it certainly has taught me, is the extent to which we find ourselves constantly having to respond to a world that is, subject to change and to flux. I mean, if we just think about this quickly for a moment, if we had said a few months before coronavirus had emerged that this statement, existence is a risk, a gamble, the world is fundamentally unstable. Now, if I had made that statement just before COVID, then it might have been described as a bit melodramatic of me, which I would have agreed with. And yet, how the world has changed. I mean, we have seen risk and instability on such a scale, haven't we? Businesses in particular, but all of us too. But this must surely be because the many environments in which we find ourselves are themselves always changing. And not only this, but these environments do not change in a predictable fashion. For example, we might be healthy for years and disease, such as coronavirus, strikes us when we least expect it. So wherever we are in life, whatever type of business we may run or profession we are in, I think it is important for us to realize that we can never completely control our environment or transform it to such an extent that we can drive out all uncertainty.
Yeah, interesting points. So with that being said, how can we adapt and face up to the reality of our lives then? What extent can we modify the risky, uncertain nature of the world that we now find ourselves in? And, to what extent, will that life still be, inescapably risky?
Yeah, I would say that a key to addressing our vulnerability really as individuals seems to lie in how effectively we're able to come to terms with and take advantage of the fact that life is fundamentally ambiguous. I mean, we have to find ways of learning to live with the contingent, with the possibility that there may not be simple answers to complex questions, and that our decisions will have to be based on negotiations between many differing and sometimes competing demands. I mean, there is a human tendency to think in binaries, isn't there, such as good and evil, or love and hate, pleasure and pain, etc., etc. And much was made of this narrative in the early stages of the pandemic, wasn't it, in terms of the economy versus healthcare, and of course the individual versus the collective, and being selfless for the greater good of the many. You know, we see this in the debate around vaccinations, such as, you know, taking a COVID vaccine for the good of those around you as well as for the good of yourself. But are there ways in which we can think creatively in a non-binary sense? That's my point here, particularly in the area of collective responsibility. You know, binary thinking might provide emotionally comforting certainties, but the natural and the human world is not binary. Everything is laid out by degrees of variation. So thinking in a non-binary way, such as viewing life as fundamentally ambiguous, for example, as I've just mentioned, does highlight that we can experience equal and opposite emotions at the same time, which of course we do, which of course is true to life, true to the experience of being in the world, and true to the experience of businesses. And so much more, you know, binary thinking, such as realizing how life is ambiguous, might help to negotiate the complex field of experience which coronavirus has become a symbol of.
Yeah, can you give us an example of this at work, you know, or how this may play out for businesses or for our clients or in society in general?
Of course, no, absolutely. And I'd say compassion is one such prism, particularly when collective responsibility is expressed through compassion in public life. A society then that promotes adequate compassion as an important ingredient of good citizenship. So activities born of compassion can also be powerful antidotes to anxiety, actually, and to the binary ways of thinking that anxiety spawns. So the anxiety of our current time has been working for many, many months now as a signal, I would suggest. The anxiety of our current time has been working, you know, as an indication for the possibility of change. And I would say that by working and thinking creatively with our anxiety, rather than being a victim of it, we can perhaps use it to transform lives for the better. So in looking to the future, we have to know that the risk can never be eradicated, as we said earlier, and uncertainty can never be eliminated. But having an awareness of the complexities of a situation can help our responses to be more sort of nuanced and ultimately more effective.
Brilliant. So as a final thought, what would you leave us with today?
I would end by saying that fragility that lay unnoticed previously within personal relationships or in business relationships will now almost certainly have been exposed or unveiled by the manifold implications and impacts that coronavirus continues to have. We should probably be aware that this leaves us more vulnerable in the short term. But what can be developed is a more open, honest, and liberating attitude to clients and customers, as well as to families and loved ones, and indeed to society as a whole, as well as perhaps to ourselves in addition, if we're being really honest.
Great, thanks, Glenn. Really interesting discussion today. If anyone has any questions or would like to know more about how Charles Stanley can help you or your clients, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you very much for watching today.